For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the latest readout video from our free Wednesday Wake Up newsletter, to which you should subscribe. And yes, we're back to our usual setup. The weather outside may be frightful, so the alarmists say, but the fire is certainly delightful. And just in time for a quick globetrot from charming Vancouver, which is 16th on our all-time list of views by city, to the smoldering wreck of COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. Yes, we're still on about that, because we predicted it would be a bust before it even convened, and we were right. The reason is that the delegates, having given up on limiting emissions of greenhouse gases even before COP28 in Abu Dhabi, realized that in Azerbaijan, the main order of business was giving up on the fallback of having rich countries give poor countries trillions of dollars to help the latter cope with all the terrible weather the former supposedly caused. Amazingly, governments of poor countries were really into getting giant sacks of cash annually from rich countries, but governments of rich countries failed to warm to the idea. So the conference ended with the usual extension past the formal deadline, this year by a grueling 35 hours to 5:31 a.m. Baku time on Sunday morning, sleep deprivation being a famously effective form of torture to break people's wills, whereupon groggy delegates signed something unimportant that they couldn't understand or refuse anyway, and UN Climate Change News predictably called it, quote, a breakthrough agreement, end quote. But nobody was fooled. No sooner had the gavel descended than India's chief negotiator denounced the process as stage-managed, called the amount agreed to a paltry sum, added, quote, I am sorry to say that we cannot accept it, end quote, and then called the deal, quote, nothing more than an optical illusion, end quote. So, a promise too costly to pay is too paltry to accept, as we predicted. And if we saw it coming, why didn't they? How recently it seems, especially to nostalgic COP junkies, that the climate world gathering at their meetings really believed they were going to save humanity from the dreaded carbon pollution. As recently as COP21 in Paris in 2015, the assembled politicians set pseudo-targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions that would supposedly have held the global temperature rise from pre-industrial times to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And yes, at Baku they still had 1.5 Celsius in the Soviet-style slogans on the walls, but 1.5 C never was within reach. As we pointed out years ago, the same computer models that claimed man-made emissions were causing an RCP 8.5 level heating catastrophe also said that if everyone did meet their Paris targets, it would change the temperature in 2100 by roughly 1/10 of a degree, hardly worth getting excited over, let alone bankrupted by. But one thing we learned at Baku was that if we got a nickel for every time we thought, told you so, we wouldn't have to ask for donations ever again. Since we don't, please send money. In the newsletter, we also mentioned Roger Pilkey Jr.'s description of venturing into the hot new B-Sky app because, quote, they told me that it is far more welcoming for discussion about energy and climate, end quote, only to find that the activists created a blacklist promoted among others by, quote, one of the lead scientists of the U.S. National Climate Assessment, end quote. And then, from the Everybody Knows file, quote, there is still considerable debate among analysts over when global demand for oil will peak, with estimates ranging between later this decade and 2050, end quote. Or not in anybody's lifetime based on mere trends. But what are they to dogma? In fact, oil seems to be a difficult concept for journalists in a number of ways. The New York Times Moscow bureau chief, another galactic metropolitan covering COP29, quote, bathed in oil during the UN climate summit. It was crude oil from a half-mile underground, pumped into a bathtub at a hotel in Azerbaijan, making me look a little like an animal stuck in an oil spill, end quote. Yes, it would do that. However, it seems that in Naftalan, which is a 4-hour drive from Baku, or longer if he took a Lada, but almost certainly he made the trip in a gas-powered car, quote, the chocolate-covered oil extracted there doesn't burn. Instead, the locals and Azerbaijani scientists say it heals if you bathe in it, end quote. Naturally, he says that it's going to run out as peak oils are peak or whatever it's doing, perhaps within a mere 60 years. But in the meantime, the journalist wound up covered in oil from headboard to bed sheets. Duh. I mean, we're all for local color. But oil is a fuel, not a medicine. Oh, and in the newsletter, we also note that Marina Hyde in The Guardian, and it's surprising, but our motto, or one of them, is credit where due, eviscerates Jaguar's new woke ad featuring pansexual space aliens rather than those boring old cars, noting, quote, hilariously, there aren't even any cars to buy for a while because Jaguar will now halt output entirely for at least a year with 3 new EVs not due for sale till 2026, end quote. But the firm boasts of 15 DEI groups. Oh well, at least ceasing to manufacture and sell cars will reduce its carbon footprint. And here's another told you so. Governments across the Western world have been unreasonably enthusiastic about electric vehicles for years. But nowhere that we're aware of more than in Canada, where politicians have hurled tens of billions of dollars in subsidies into manufacturers of the cars, their batteries, and so forth. Which brings us to the looming bankruptcy of Northvolt, which, make that the actual bankruptcy of Northvolt, despite being the wave of the future in the minds of politicians now underwater in the polls who have saddled Canada with a national debt north of $1 trillion, partly because they had no idea what not to give money to or how not to give it. As the wise old saying routinely not repeated in the corridors of power, especially in this country, has it, governments can't pick winners, but losers sure can pick governments, and Canada's was especially ripe for the plucking. In the newsletter, we also note that there was some bad weather recently, which is normally treated as a terrifying and novel man-made climate change-driven affliction. But not this time, because in Britain, quote, dozens of schools closed and road and train travel ground to a halt in many parts of the UK on Tuesday as a cold snap brought snow, ice, and sleet across the country, end quote. It's not your grandfather's global heating, is it? Though, of course, we're back to that business where if it gets cold, it's just a snap, whereas if it gets hot, it's not merely a wave, it's climate change. In this case, of course, the story didn't contain a single instance of the word climate. And at the same time, in New Delhi, they had a worse problem. Quote, authorities in India's capital shut schools, halted construction, and banned non-essential trucks from entering the city on Monday after air pollution shot up to its worst level this season, end quote. Anyone want to blame that one on climate? They didn't dare. And then a bomb cyclone hit the west coast of North America. That's the thing that used to be called a winter storm until those got dull. And to its credit, again, the Weather Network didn't blame climate, despite in other ways getting fairly excited about a winter storm in winter. But, as you know, if it gets hot, climate, we're all gonna die. Meanwhile, in case you were worried that a serious, broad-minded look at climate might somehow erupt, you can relax. Oxford, which used to be a university, now does stuff like, quote, building a mighty global network for climate journalists, end quote, so that these poor waifs who, quote, have the unenviable task of navigating this uncharted territory, a sea of information and a range of often conflicting viewpoints in their endeavors to convey basic facts and what they mean for their audiences, end quote, can feel validated without actually offering solid information or, in particular, a range of often conflicting viewpoints. And just in case an actual debate could have broken out anyway, at the G20 Leaders Summit Carbon Fest in Rio, site of next year's COP if they even bother holding it, quote, the Brazilian government, the United Nations, and UNESCO are joining forces to strengthen research and measures to address disinformation campaigns that are delaying and derailing climate action, end quote. Yes, Big Green is watching you. In the newsletter, we also continue our Green Blackout series, looking at how the IPCC handles the issue of global greening. In the previous newsletter, we showed that if you dutifully read the summaries for policymakers, that's SPMs to insiders, you would learn nothing about it. And in this week's newsletter, we examine the technical summaries. And, to spoil the plot somewhat, deep down in the chapters, they do admit, somewhat grudgingly in places, that yes, extra CO2 in the air translates into more plant growth around the world and better water use efficiency by plants. Which is a big, if well-hidden deal, since it counts against the idea of CO2 as the dreaded carbon pollution. And it is well hidden, because each of the working groups connected with the IPCC puts out rather lengthy summaries of their own even lengthier reports, and you have to get to page 84 in the Working Group 1 technical summary and not blink to catch this admission. Quote, increasing atmospheric CO2, warming at high latitudes, and land management interventions have contributed to the observed greening trend, but there is low confidence in their relative roles. There is medium confidence that increased plant growth associated with CO2 fertilization is the main driver of the observed increase in amplitude of the seasonal cycle of atmospheric CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere, end quote. As for Working Group 2, which specifically deals with impacts of adding CO2 to the air, the technical summary makes no mention of greening. Same with Working Group 3, which supposedly deals with policy responses. The report chapters themselves actually have a lot to say on the subject, so they do know about it. They just don't want you to. Not only does the IPCC not want to talk about global greening, their models get the role of plants in the global carbon cycle woefully wrong. A new study in Nature looked at how much CO2 plants gobble up every year, and the standard estimate of 120 petagrams annually, which dates back to the 1980s, turns out to be low by 31%. Oh well, back to the settled science, which is always worse than it is. Also, warming at twice the global average is the go-to phrase for alarmists wanting to scare you into thinking that your country, town, street, continent, whatever it may be, is in exceptional trouble. But we found this gem in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land on page 9. Quote, since the pre-industrial period, the land surface air temperature has risen nearly twice as much as the global average temperature, high confidence, end quote. Exactly. Because, you see, comparatively little warming has happened over the oceans. And since the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, your country is warming twice as fast as the global average, not because it's special, but because it's on land, which is actually pretty normal for places where people live. And another thing, is warming accelerating as the alarmists frequently claim? Well, a new study in Nature Communications says no. Panic at 11. Also in the newsletter, we note that Roger Pielke Jr. has published part 2 of his expose on the tactical science behind extreme weather attribution, specifically on the formation of a new panel of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences tasked with looking into the technical basis of weather attribution, which has accepted cash sponsorship by both the Bezos Earth Fund and a wealthy donor to a climate activist group. Oh, and a leading figure in the World Weather Attribution Advocacy Group will sit on it, along with a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists' Science Hub for Climate Litigation Action Committee. And to think people are losing faith in the impartiality of experts. Also, in the newsletter, we note that meteorologist Chris Martz has a post on X going over the numbers on Greenland ice loss. In response to somebody else howling that the Greenland ice sheet, quote, is losing around 30 million tons of ice an hour due to the climate crisis, 20% more than what scientists originally thought, end quote, Martz observes that 30 million seems like an enormous number, but at that rate it would take 11,035 years for the ice cap to melt. And meanwhile, Greenland will contribute about 0.7 of a millimeter per year to sea level rise, or 1 foot every 417 years. So we are all going to snooze. Finally, from the CO2science.org archive, we bring you news about Brassica napus L, or canola, also known as Canadian oil low acid, or originally rapeseed, which was not exactly a marketer's dream name. Between 2005 and 2019, 14 experiments adding 300 parts per million of CO2 to the atmosphere found that there was an average increase in photosynthesis of 60%. So, the canola crop on Saskatchewan's vast farms will benefit from the rest of us burning neighboring Alberta's vast hydrocarbon reserves. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and yes, I told you so.